Welcome back, everybody. This is another episode of Conversations on Anarres. My name is Joseph Orozco. I am one of the co-directors of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations about ending oppression, exploitation, war, and empire. And on this program, Conversations on Anarres, we discuss how to envision alternative futures with activists, scholars, organizers, helping us to try to imagine what to do using the radical imagination to envision alternatives. My guest today is someone who I'm very excited to share with you all today. This is Dr. Jesse Cohn. He is Associate Professor of English at Purdue University Northwest in Indiana. And he's written an article in the latest issue of Perspectives on Anarchist Theory, number 33, that came out this year, called De-Modernizing Anarchism. Now, I invited him here today to talk to us a little bit about this idea of demodernizing anarchism. Let me first begin by introducing Dr. Cohn. Dr. Cohn, as I mentioned, teaches at Purdue University Northwest. His research is into 20th and 21st century literature and pop culture, but particularly the cultural history of anarchism. He's also a member of the board for the Institute for Anarchist Studies, which publishes the Perspectives on Anarchist Theory, amongst other things. Among Professor Cohn's publications are a couple of things that are notable. First, a book that he published with AK Press in 2015 called Underground Passages, Anarchist Resistance Culture, 1848 to 2011. And he has a forthcoming book with the University of Mississippi Press in about a year called Hot Equations, Science, Fantasy, and the Radical Imagination on a Troubled Planet. So welcome, Jesse. It's a pleasure to have you on here.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor.
I wanted to talk to you about this essay that I found very fascinating that, as I mentioned, is in the latest issue of Perspectives on Anarchist Theory. The title of it is De-Modernizing Anarchism. And so I wanted to touch base with you a little bit to find out your background and your expertise in anarchism, and to talk a little bit about this article. We'll be able to link the article. It's on the Institute for Anarchist Studies website, and I'll link that in our notes. But I wanted to first talk with you about your background. How did you first decide to become a scholar of anarchist thought? Many of your publications and your presentations in the last, say, decade have been about the cultural history of anarchism.
Mhm.
So how did you decide that this was a path that you wanted to pursue in your scholarly life?
Well, my superhero origin story kind of starts on this back road in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. I was on a summer trip with some friends, and we stopped at a roadside yard sale, and I picked up this really interesting looking paperback, which was the Essential Works of Anarchism, edited by Marshall Schatz, and I started reading in the car about Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, and I just kind of fell in love. So,
Well, let me ask you about that sort
yeah.
of early fascination. What does anarchism mean to you now that you've had time to think about it after all these years? What fascinated you about this perspective, this way of thinking? Why did it become something that you decided that you wanted to devote your work toward?
Ooh, that's a bunch of questions at once. Let's see. Okay, so what does anarchism mean to me? Um, it's a most centrally opposition to oppression and domination. Um, in all forms, including especially capitalism and the state, and and thinking about that in all sorts of different dimensions in terms of racism, sexism, and other kinds of oppressions that people face. I think that one of the distinctive features of anarchism is that typically it emphasizes this the union of means and ends. That we don't believe that there's any point to capturing the state in order to use it to somehow solve our problems, because we can't get to the future that we want by imitating or sort of embodying the worst things about our present. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. I appreciate that. That makes sense to sort of lay out the perspective. Like, why did this idea of this political philosophy emphasizing anti-oppression, anti-capitalism, why did this become something that you wanted to devote your scholarly life toward?
Um, well, I really sort of in college I started to get the idea that maybe this was not just a fascinating subject in its own right, but also kind of a subject position, right? A lens to look at the world through, and that you could see things through that lens that you would not see otherwise. Um, so I started looking at elements of colonialism and so forth in things that I was reading, thinking, okay, how can we expose that sort of latent colonialism, right? And Kropotkin came to my aid.
So not just it became sort of a methodology for you in terms of the kinds of reading that you wanted to do with the literature that you were focused on, but it also touched you personally in a way. It seems
Mhm.
that it was something that became part of your own political stance. Can you talk a little bit about why it spoke to you at a personal level in any kind of way?
I basically hated capitalism and the state, and and really sort of understood on a pretty uh, fundamental level how much of a travesty the various kinds of authoritarian communist revolutions had been, and I knew that something better was possible.
Mm. So it was a sort of a kind of trying to find an alternative to authoritarian capitalist structures and authoritarian
Yes,
sort of communist Soviet uh, and other kinds of ways of thinking, that there had to be some other kind of way for a radical perspective to take.
yes.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Well, I wanted to talk mostly about this essay in which you bring up so many of these different kinds of themes that have been part of your work for a while. So, uh, in this article that is entitled "Demodernizing Anarchism,"
Mhm.
you begin by talking about how anarchism, this political perspective that we're talking about, is often talked about, is often theorized as a European political philosophy that has its origins in Europe, but then spread worldwide. It spread globally. So
Yeah.
even if there are different kinds of anarchism in many different regions in the world, Latin America, Asia, and so forth, the core of it, the core concept of it appear to be European in origin. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Okay. So one way of telling the story of anarchist history is to give it this genealogy, which is fascinating in its own right. Like, how did anarchist ideas travel from Proudhon and Bakunin, all the way to China, in the early 20th century? How did anarchist ideas land in Australia and in parts of Africa and Latin America particularly? Um, and to some extent, those core ideas and even those images, those symbols, become locally flavored, as it were, right? People find their own particular sort of uses for them, and reinterpret them in local ways. But the genealogy is still pretty clear, and this is a satisfying story to tell in a bunch of ways. Um, it leaves out a whole lot of what anarchy is really about. It leaves out all those for whom, as the saying goes, we get anarchism from our grandmothers, right? As opposed to from these sort of canonical texts.
Right, right. So I guess I should qualify that part of it, as you're saying, is a kind of anarchist theory is what you're sort of tracing in this genealogy, a way
Mhm.
of thinking about certain key, central texts that then got picked up by activists and then uh, sort of spread globally, as
Right.
opposed to the kind of way, we might say, I don't know, the kind of a James Scott kind of a notion of anarchist practices that are embedded in everyday life. So we're not talking about that kind of thing. We're talking about the ideas, the high theory that gets globalized
Mhm.
in a certain period. But a lot of that is the globalization of certain kind of key ideas found in high European theory.
Sure.
Okay.
And there are interesting interactions between those different traditions,
Yeah.
all along the way, right? And, Proudhon and Bakunin and Kropotkin were in some parts inspired by examples from other kinds of cultures and traditions.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
Kropotkin in particular.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, there's been so many really good recent books talking about the development and the origins of this high European theory, and not just theory, but organizational practice. I'm thinking of Zoe Baker's new book, Ways and Means, which I think is a really great history of that kind of the development of European anarchism in that kind of way. But Zoe's very clear to sort of say, I'm only talking about the sort of development in Europe and not so much the important global history of anarchism. And that's part of what you're talking about here, is
Mhm.
indicating that this was a spread from those ideas outside. So one of those regions in which, right, anarchism spreads and takes root is in North America, in the United States, with some folks that you talked about before, right? Some big figures that were part of that immigrant push to bring anarchist ideas. Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, and others. Um,
Mhm.
so. In theory today, we often hear different voices, particularly from many different kinds of Native American scholars, who have been saying when we think about radical leftist theories and politics, we need to be considerate and think about forms of decolonization. So some Native American scholars, for instance, have long talked about the importance and the need for the decolonization of theory and political practice. Now, this is something that you bring up in your article as well. You acknowledge that there are these calls for decolonization. I was
Mhm.
wondering, could you explain a little bit about what that call is about, that you are acknowledging and recognizing as something that needs to be thought about and done in leftist theory in North America?
Well, the the word decolonization, and it's been bandied about a lot in the academy to the point that a couple of native scholars, K. Wayne Yang and Eve Tuck, had to write this very sort of forceful declaration that uh, you can't just use this as a metaphor, for whatever kinds of cool methodology you want to talk about. It has to mean giving the land back and so forth. I take that to heart. That's an important insistence.
Yeah, I take it that part of the call by some of these theorists is to say that, um, if we're thinking about looking for frameworks and perspectives for radical collective liberation in the world, or particularly in the Americas, that we should be cognizant, particularly of European theories that might have been involved in colonization or that justified colonization. So your
Sure.
article is beginning by thinking about European theory, right? And you acknowledge that there are these calls for decolonization, which means to think carefully about the ways in which practices and theory perhaps have been used to justify settler colonialism
Yes.
in the Americas. And so you acknowledge that, and you take seriously the call for not just treating it as a metaphor, but that it has to be a part of serious political practice in
Mhm.
addition to theory of any kind of collective liberation process in the Americas. But the thing that
Sure.
you do in this article, that I find really
Mhm.
fascinating, is that you acknowledge the radicalness of the call for decolonization, not just as a metaphor. You accept that assumption, but then you take your article in a really, I think, interesting way. Is that you think that the real thing that we need to start thinking about, what we need to start thinking about, perhaps in terms of anarchist theory that you're calling a sort of primarily European idea, is that we need to engage in a different kind of examination that you call demodernization, right? So
Right.
not just decolonization, but demodernization. So I find this really fascinating. So I wanted to ask you, um, h- how do you understand the idea of modernity? What is the
Mm.
modernity that you're talking about, and what exactly does it mean to examine how that idea of modernity shapes political philosophy like anarchism? So first, what do you mean by modernity in this
Okay.
context?
So, there's so many competing definitions of the word, but roughly, I understand by modernity, a period of time of about five centuries in depth, that really sees the rise of the modern state and the emergence of capitalism. And those twin institutions really kind of define the heart of modernity. Um, it it, uh, it has some fruitful results in a bunch of different ways. It launches the whole sort of rights regime that we're used to, and that affords some shelter for folks like you and me. Um, but taken as a whole, I think it's something to be questioned and perhaps rejected in on block, right? Um, I think we can sift out some things that are worth carrying forward, but um, the the sort of total program of modernity, I think we might consider leaving behind. And I think that's where we have to think about um, how anarchism itself is kind of a product of modernity,
Mm,
and became sort of a missionary for modernity, as was entering, say Brazil and Argentina and the U.S. and so forth. It becomes another sort of colonial force, that is swept along, by waves of immigration, which are also waves of colonization.
mm. So let me see if I understand this correctly. The way that you're sort of understanding modernity here is a kind of worldview that
Mhm.
develops at a certain kind of world historical moment, primarily European.
I'd say not just a worldview, but really a social system, right?
Right,
Um, very concrete as well as mental.
right,
Um,
right.
right,
So a kind of
and it yeah, it really does kind of stem from Europe and spread out to colonize the rest of the world.
gotcha, gotcha. So it's a this kind of a perspective that influences the development of economic, social, cultural institutions, that becomes a sort of globalized perspective, but that sort of shapes
Mhm.
everyday life in a variety of different ways. The features of this thing that we're calling modernity are, um, a kind of view about, if I understood what you said in your article, a certain kind of view about the relationship of knowledge to the scientific method,
Yeah.
a kind of reliance on capitalism as the predominant um, economic driver,
Hmm.
and primarily a sort of kind of an overall sense of history as one as progressive.
Hmm.
That it's a linear sort of view of the world moving towards better and more progress, both technologically, economically,
Yes.
ethically, and moral, right? So progress, science, capitalism, and perhaps, as we're talking about here, right, a kind of sense of colonialism, of the importance of this kind of domination and empire. Um,
Yeah. And running through all of these, uh, part of the mental equipment that you're referring to, is this profound sense that the world is split in two,
mm,
between the human and the non-human, um,
ah,
right? And the non-human world is seen as basically kind of inert and unchanging, whereas the human world is what progresses, what moves, what develops,
right,
um,
right.
and what is characterized also by logos, by language.
Ah, yeah.
Whereas the non-human world is held to be basically silent and in a sense meaningless.
Right, right. So very good. So right, this corresponds, of course, I guess, with what we might call like the European Enlightenment, the development of the
Hmm.
scientific method. These ideas of human reason as being the sort of central kind of capacity of human beings, and the breakdown of the human world as the apex of creation,
Hmm.
or of the world, and everything else being inert objects, natural
Right.
resources,
Yeah.
for the use by human beings, right? I've heard this view sort of been referred to before also by some folks as like the dead earth
Hmm.
perspective, right? That the earth is there and it's essentially things, but human beings are subjects.
Right.
And in the colonial sort of perspective, right, to think about this is that some human beings are more human than others because of the supposed capacity to develop reason, and so part of this is also a
Hmm.
kind of a distinction between civilization and non-civilized civilization, and barbarism, civilization, and quote unquote savagery,
Right.
right? So there's all these kinds of binaries that play into this worldview and world setup.
Hmm.
So if I understand that kind of that perspective of modernity, part of what you want to say is that you think that what what we need to start doing now is thinking about the ways in which modernity infects something, or has influenced the ways in which anarchism shapes itself.
Sure.
And so part of what you ask is that we need to rethink the foundations of anarchism and move it away from the modernist assumptions that we've talked about human nature, science,
Right.
technology, right? You're sort of thinking, not only do we need to decolonize something like anarchism, but we need to demodernize it. We need to sort of see if there's a possibility of thinking of anarchism without these kinds of assumptions that have come to us from the 1600s, from Europe. So,
Yeah.
what exactly is what is the alternative to a modernist anarchism?
Well, it might involve learning from those people who get anarchism from their grandmothers, um, right? I'm thinking here of the fact that most of the societies on Earth that have known anything like stateless, not non-capitalism, or communism, have been indigenous societies, right? Um, they knew some things about how to make that work, that we've had to arrive at by different means. Um, so and one of the things that typifies again the same indigenous societies is a certain attachment to animist ideas. The rejection of that sort of division between the human and non-human. Um,
Yeah, so please explain this a little bit
yeah.
because I think that this is a really important kind of point in your argument. Is your article is not just a critique perhaps of like the European foundations of anarchism, but you also go on to say there is perhaps some places in which we might think about rethinking anarchism that don't rely on those assumptions. And as you say, this is by looking at different ways of imagining alternatives. One of these alternatives
Mhm.
being animism. Um,
Yeah.
what exactly do you mean by that?
Okay. So that process of creating what you call the dead earth, which is a great phrase for that. Um, Max Weber, the famous sociologist, called it a project of Entzauberung, right, which in German means literally kind of demagicking. Um, the the and really what that means is kind of the suppression of animism, the suppression of the idea that the non-human world might also manifest some human like properties, manifest sensitivity and sentience and intelligence and will and things like that. Um, and this was an assumption that was that's frequent in indigenous societies. The idea that, for instance, in some cases, even stones might talk if you listen the right way.
Right.
Um,
So if I understand this correctly, part of what
yeah.
you're saying is that one of the big assumptions that you might sort of characterize as part of the high modernist ideas in European thinking is this notion of scientific process based on a scientific methodology that separates the known universe into human and non-human subjects and objects, human
Mhm.
and non-natural resources. And this was done by, thank you for bringing that up, right? This kind of Weberian idea of demystifying the world
Right.
of believing that everything can be explained through human reason and everything can be labeled and controlled primarily, right? So this is where you might get something like from Horkheimer and Adorno, right? That this
Hmm.
process was really about the control of nature, as if you can document it, if you can categorize it, if you can scientifically catalog it, you have then a way of being able to manipulate and control the non-human world, and
Yeah.
that leads to that sort of dead human or dead planet kind of view, is that the dead planet is there for our use. And
Right.
so we can sort of figure out the best ways to efficiently, as Horkheimer and Adorno say, make it happen. And
Right.
so part of what you're thinking about is like, we need to get rid of all of that, right? That sort of emphasis, perhaps, and think about, are there ways in which we can think about our relationship to the natural world, perhaps, that do not rely on that gulf,
Sure.
and ask, what can we learn from perhaps indigenous cultures about their relationship to the natural world that sees the natural world as not as objects, but perhaps as potential subjects that we
Right.
must engage in. There's lots of different examples of this, and lots of, deep ecology, different movements in Latin America to sort
Hmm.
of give legal subjectivity to rivers
Yeah.
and so forth. These are all big movements that have been going on in the past, say, 15, 20 years. Um, yeah, I'm curious how you think that this can influence anarchism. Like, what does it mean to have an anarchism that is demodernized and re-influenced by some kind of notion of animism?
Well, I think one source of inspiration for me is sort of digging back through the archive and realizing that anarchism never fit all that well into modernity in some ways. That from the very beginning, yeah, but Bakunin, for instance, when he's explaining what it means to him to be a materialist, says, for us, matter is not the same as what these sort of vulgar materialists have in mind. The sort of scientific materialists. Then for them, matter is this dead, dumb, inert kind of stuff that just waits for human beings to act on it. For us, there is no such thing as this vile matter, he says. Um, Matter for us is active and has a kind of kind of intrinsic impetus um, that makes the world what it is. I think drawing on some of those ideas, and uniting them with some recent philosophy, particularly I'm thinking of not only the new animists, but also the new materialists, um, who are philosophers who say that, again, maybe we need to start thinking of matter as being much more active, maybe invested with certain kinds of agency, even, and think through what that might mean for how we live.
How do you think that that would change anarchist ideas?
Well, um, in all kinds of ways. So so I think that that would change our stance towards indigenous cultures, for one thing.
Mm.
Um, right now, a lot of anarchists who are sort of still carriers of the that idea of modernity, um, are in this sort of utterly awkward position of coming to be involved with things like, the no DAPL movement at Standing Rock, um, while at the same time not sharing any of the premises of the people who are there defending the land, um, right? Not believing in the sacred, not giving any sort of agency to the land itself, um, and so on. I think we could probably do better than that.
So, if I understand correctly, you think that there are kinds of ways in which anarchists still today, some anarchists perhaps, are
Yeah.
influenced by the modernist ideas, so that they would look at some of the kinds of ways that people are seeking collective liberation today, like native struggles, and sort of be turned off by what they might consider the, I don't know, the woo woo or the too spiritual
Hmm.
aspects, and they want something sort of more hard and definite in terms
Hmm.
of thinking about like what strategy and practice and what alternative vision should be. So you think that that kind of attitude can actually be a barrier to a productive kind of anarchism today.
Yeah, it can come off as a kind of arrogance,
Mm,
again, sort of another form of white people moving in and saying we know how to do things better,
right, right,
right?
right, right.
Let us bring you, this one model of rationality, which we'll call rationality.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. Well, you sort of asked, you sort of have addressed this kind of idea that I had in my head about my next question I wanted to ask about you, but
mhm.
um, um, I guess what kinds of forms of collective liberation does a demodernized anarchism open up for us? Part of this, as you said, you think it might allow us to be able to engage in forms of solidarity
Yeah.
that modernist ideas sort of stand in the way of. And that makes sense.
Mhm.
A kind of presumption that we know what's up, right? That there's a
Yeah.
certain kind of way of how progress should happen. But I wonder too if just thinking or speculating about this, if you think that
Mhm.
there are, you know, does modernism influence the kinds of radical possibilities that anarchists envision about what the future might look like?
Yeah.
Right. If you think about, right, if I understand correctly from your understanding about anarchism before, right, we're talking about like how do we build a world with no authoritarian oppression. That means no domination, no exploitation, anti-capitalist,
Right.
non-hierarchical kinds of forms of organization. Um, how do you think that? I mean, do you think that modernism has influenced that vision of a future world that we should aspire to? Do you think that demodernized anarchism can provide a way better for us to imagine getting to something like that?
Probably. I think that when it comes to the anarchist tradition, like other traditions, there has to be a really careful process of kind of unraveling things. Bookchin actually has this image that he uses of sort of braided elements of domination and liberation
Mhm.
being sort of disentangled. So I think a process of disentanglement probably needs to happen. We
Uh-huh.
need to figure out what, in large part, what anarchism does look like without those kind of modernist certainties.
Right, right. No, I like that idea, right? That part of what we need to be thinking about is first this extrication, these radical kinds of considerations of like what does liberation look like,
Mhm,
um, uh, and perhaps, I mean, this is a way in which anarchism can separate itself from other forms of leftism that are much more sort of vanguardist in a kind of way. I mean, it
mhm,
seems in a certain kind of way that those kinds of notions, the one thing that anarchism has always striven to kind of separate itself out is from sort of authoritarian leftism that's
mhm,
might be embodied in certain forms of Marxist-Leninism. But it seems now that part of the critique is that some of these forms like that are grounded in a kind of modernist paradigm of
uh-huh,
liberation and progress. And so, part of this might be that we need to rethink the idea of the revolution. Like,
sure.
what does the revolution mean? What are we seeking when we try to organize for the liberation towards the revolution? Does that make sense, or is that part of this modernist paradigm that we need to rethink about what does it mean to live in a free kind of way?
Yeah. So I mean, so many elements to think about there. Um, oh goodness, I had a train of thought and then I lost it. Let me see if I can find it again.
No, I'm just wondering because I think that I mean I know that a lot of folks,
Mhm.
nowadays, right, despair about the future, and I know that your work and your next book is
Yeah,
about these
yeah,
kinds of things, about thinking about the future. But I mean, I think that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that people around the world are really struck by a loss of hope because they don't see a lot of alternatives possible. That it
right.
seems like we're stuck with climate catastrophe and the kinds of broken systems that we have, and thinking about alternatives to that is very, very hard, particularly for young people nowadays. But, the hope has always been there's revolution. There's
Mhm.
revolutionary movements, there's revolutionary strategy and practice. There are ways in which if we just, can organize ourselves that we can, build this better world. But your work makes me think, I mean, maybe some of that kind of way of thinking and offering hope is grounded in these modernist assumptions that we ought to really rethink. And if that's true, then what's the alternative? What's
Mhm.
is there a revolution in an animist anarchism? What would that look like? What would that mean? So I think that this raises a lot of questions and
Mhm.
open spaces for thinking about like what is the radical imagination for the future from a demodernized anarchist standpoint?
Yeah. I think I'm still committed to the idea of massive transformation, right? And and the urgency of that being significant. We better change our ways pretty fast, or we're cooked. Um, quite literally. At the same time, I don't know. You're asking good questions here.
So we need mass action, we need social movements, but
Yeah.
part of that is just at a certain point for survival purposes now. And this
Mhm.
tracks at least with what's going on in a lot of the world today, particularly amongst anarchist circles. So much focus
Yeah.
is on sustaining just survival. Mutual aid is a big sort of principle underlying a lot of activism going on right now. And then the question is like, what are we building toward?
Mhm.
And I think that your work really sort of starts to raise a lot of questions about like maybe some of this stuff is, as I said before, infected by assumptions that, we really don't want in thinking about what a liberated free world could be like in the future.
Yeah. I think one thing I'm putting forward is that a demonetized anarchism might look a lot more like pragmatism, and again, there's some precedent for that. Proudhon says some things that are very close to this sort of pragmatist philosophy that would start to emerge only decades later. He says, the idea is born from action and must return to action. Otherwise it's corrupted. Um, right?
So by pragmatism, you mean like the
Uh,
philosophical movement of like folks like William James and
sure.
Peirce and those folks is
Yeah. You know, in a broad way. The idea being that instead of having kind of a master plan with this clear and distinct view of what's to be done, um, yeah, we muddle through
mm,
things. We figure
yeah,
out ways of muddling through things together.
yeah,
Right. So even if my ontology, my sort of picture of what's real, is radically different from yours, nonetheless, we can find ways to work together. Pragmatism is kind of this principle of interoperability, if you want to
mm,
think about it that way.
yeah, yeah. No,
William James had this useful image of the corridor in a hotel, right? That sort of links all the private rooms. Um, it's not someplace you can set up a bed and live, but it's a way of communicating between.
yeah. Yeah, no, this is fascinating actually, because pragmatism is one of the areas that I work in my area of specialization in philosophy as well. And I do know that William James, in some of his notes and his writings, did often express
Mhm.
quite a lot of fascination and affiliation with anarchism, right? At certain points he says, "I believe I am an anarchist," and his library is known to have contained some anarchist readings, so he's familiar with this stuff, and so that sort of idea of that point of contact and maybe
Sure.
pragmatism as a way of moving ahead for anarchism is really fascinating.
Yeah, there's so many affinities to be found.
Wow, amazing. Well, so I want to ask you this, right? Part of what you said is you're thinking about your next book is thinking about science fiction, fantasy, other forms of speculative fiction, and literatures and culture for thinking about a radically different future. Um,
Mhm.
um, I wanted to ask more specifically about your work. What's the future of your work in anarchism look like? What are the next projects that you're interested in that are thinking about anarchism, particularly as part of that radical imagination project?
Well, I've been thinking a lot, and this is going to be part of that forthcoming book. It's stuff that I want to develop even further. One sort of source of inspiration for me is this thread of kind of scientific thinking that was popular among anarchist circles in the early 20th century. Circa 1900 to 1940, anarchist newspapers and journals always have a science section, right? To sort of bring people up to date, and to encourage that sort of thinking. Um, in this particular time period, though, 1900 and 1940, one of the ideas that recurs frequently in those pages is this particular current of scientific thought that talked about la vie universelle, right, the universal life. Um, the idea being that there wasn't a strong distinction between living and dead matter. That in fact, um, scientists like Alfonso L. Herrera from Mexico were arguing that if under the right circumstances, um, even these sort of inorganic mixtures of chemicals could exhibit lifelike properties, could do things like propel themselves, divide, form cell walls, produce all kinds of organic looking structures. Even now, some kind of study those structures under the name of chembrionics, or chemical gardens. Right, you can do some really cool sort of home science stuff where you grow these things that are that you know are sort of crystalline, but really don't look like crystals. They don't look inorganic. They look like ferns or like mushrooms, or these various kinds familiar lifelike structures. And so for a while, those ideas, that particular thread of scientific research, was a contender for the theories of the origin of life. They, they were really sort of on that territory, talking about how life could emerge from the non-living. Um, and they got beaten out in the mid 20th century by the work of Oparin and Haldane, and then the discovery of DNA. Um, but some scientists argue that there's still some value in their work, and that for instance, it might be useful in thinking about the kinds of alien life that we might encounter. Um,
Right, right, right,
but
right. So
okay,
part of this is
yeah, so it's all very cool and futuristic and scientific. Um, but the thread there, for me, is that insistence that um, that there is no sharp divide between the living and the non-living, the human and the non-human. That even little clumps of chemicals can exhibit lifelike behavior, movement, purpose. Uh, it's a it's strangely both futuristic and at the same time, um, has all these affinities with very traditional kinds of thought, right?
mhm. So part of it is kind of the idea that the modernist assumption is that there is a certain kind of way to think about the future moving ahead with progress. We do this through scientific understanding of the world, and scientific understanding of the world is built on certain kinds of premises, or scientism, certain kinds of premises. Your work is sort of really interested in the ways in which um, there are other ways, perhaps, of even understanding science, the scientific
Sure.
paradigm of the world that perhaps is closer to traditional ecological knowledge, perhaps, even sort of traditional native understandings of relationships of human to the natural world, and looking to ways in which that might free our imaginations to think about different kinds of then political possibilities.
Hmm.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, and in some ways, I think that the work that you're talking about here is really sort of in line too with like the work that David Graeber was doing right before his death too, with the dawn of everything. Right,
Yes.
if you look at some of the ways in which different societies have arisen, you start to see in the archaeological record. He says there's not a clear path from hunter gatherers to civilization. Is that human beings were trying out all sorts of different things, and we should no longer be trapped in our imagination and thinking that there's only one trajectory of like feudalism to capitalism to socialism. There
Right.
could be a whole sort of other ways in thinking about how liberation should take place. Your work seems to be part of this, is thinking that maybe we can start to think about anarchism as a form and practice that might be liberated from these kinds of imagination traps.
Yes. Exactly. Um,
Hmm.
Actually, there's a piece I think I'd cite in the article by David Graeber. Um, I'm forgetting the title offhand, but in it he actually ventures some of these very sort of strange abstract speculations about how maybe mind is present in matter even at the very lowest kind of levels,
Hmm.
as if maybe electrons could have a sense of humor, you know,
Wow.
in their
Fascinating.
sort of unpredictability.
Interesting, interesting. Yeah, there's so much more to talk about here. Uh, sort of, and I think there's a lot of rich conversation to have about like what are the implications of your thinking for developing political practice today.
Mhm.
That you don't go so much into, you hint at in your work, but I think just sort of breaking down these assumptions and sort of laying these out is done really sort of valuable work, I think. So
Thank you.
we will definitely link to the article that you can find on the Perspectives on Anarchist Theory webpage so that people will be able to take a look at the article. And so we'll have that out there for people to take a look at. And we'll also have a link to a way of contacting you so that people can ask questions if you'd like. But I hope that this can spur some conversation amongst different anarchist collectives to sort of think about what does it mean to think about a demodernized anarchism.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you, Jesse. I appreciate your time and everything. I hope to have you back for when your book comes out about thinking about the radical imagination into the future.
You got it.
And thank you for spending your time listening to us or watching us, depending on what your platform is. We are able to be contacted through a variety of different social media. We're on all the socials. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on formerly known as Twitter, on X. You can find us on Mastodon. You can find us also on YouTube. And you can also listen to us on Spotify or wherever you find your podcasts. Please go ahead and give us a shout out, recommend us to your friends. But we would love also to hear from you about how you think perhaps that we can take some of these insights to build further anarchist political practice. How could demodernize anarchism help you in your political work? We'd love to hear what you have to say. So please give us a shout out, get us a comment, and like us below, as they say. Thanks, Jesse. Appreciate your time and hope to see you very soon.
All right. Thank you again. Take care.